The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was a cold autumn night when James Bennett, a 32-year-old salesman, found himself driving along a deserted highway. The air was crisp, and a thick fog had begun to roll in, making the winding roads even more treacherous. He was heading home after a long business trip, eager to get back to his wife and 2 young children. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the pavement and the occasional flickering of the streetlights were his only companions. As he approached a bend in the road, his headlights cut through the fog, revealing the silhouette of a young woman standing by the roadside. She was dressed in a light-colored dress that seemed out of place for the chilly weather. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and she had a forlorn look on her face. James slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Are you all right?" he asked. The woman nodded hesitantly and took a step forward. "I need a ride home," she said softly. Her voice was delicate, almost as if she were afraid to speak too loudly. James hesitated for a moment. He had always been warned about picking up strangers, but something about the girl seemed harmless, even familiar in a strange way. He reached over and unlocked the passenger door. "Hop in. It's too cold to be out here alone." She climbed into the car, her movements slow and deliberate. As she settled into the seat, James noticed that despite the cold night, she wasn't shivering. He turned up the heater anyway, hoping to make her more comfortable. "What's your name?" he asked, glancing at her as he pulled back onto the road. "Lillian," she replied, barely above a whisper. "Lillian Harper." James nodded. "Nice to meet you, Lillian. Where do you live?" She hesitated for a moment before giving him an address a few miles away, just on the outskirts of town. It wasn't far from his own home. He found it odd that she was out alone at this hour, especially dressed the way she was, but he didn't press her for details. As they drove, James tried to make conversation, but Lillian remained mostly quiet. When she did speak, her answers were brief and melancholic. Something about her demeanor unsettled him, but he shook off the feeling, attributing it to exhaustion from the long drive. After a few minutes, they reached the address she had given him, a modest old-fashioned house with a white picket fence. The front porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the small yard. "This is it," she said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes held an expression of deep sorrow. "Thank you for the ride." Before James could respond, she opened the door and stepped out. He watched as she walked toward the house, her dress billowing slightly in the night breeze. Just as she reached the front steps, James blinked, and in that split second, she was gone. His heart pounded. He rubbed his eyes, convinced that the fog or his tired mind had played a trick on him. But no, she had vanished. James sat frozen in his seat, staring at the empty porch. He had just seen her there. How could she disappear so suddenly? A chill ran down his spine. He needed to get answers. Summoning his courage, he stepped out of the car and approached the house. He knocked on the door, his pulse quickening as he waited. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with gentle, weary eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked kindly. I just gave a ride to a young woman named Lillian," James stammered. "She said she lived here, but she disappeared." The woman's face went pale, and she exhaled a shaky breath. "Lillian?" she repeated, her voice almost breaking. James nodded. "Yes. She had long dark hair, a light dress. She said this was her home." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she reached for a small table by the door. She picked up a framed photograph and held it out to him. James took the picture with trembling hands. It was a portrait of Lillian, looking just as she had in his car. Young, beautiful, with sad eyes. But the photo was old, the edges yellowed with time. "That's her," James whispered. "That's the girls I picked up." The woman swallowed hard. "Lillian was my daughter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She died 20 years ago, on this very road." James felt the air leave his lungs. "That can't be," he murmured. "I saw her. I spoke to her." The woman wiped a tear from her cheek. "You're not the first," she said. "Every few years, someone comes knocking, saying they gave her a ride, always on a foggy night, always on that stretch of road." James took a step back, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He glanced at his car, half expecting to see some sign of Lillian's presence. And then he noticed it, his jacket, the one he had draped over the seat for her. It was neatly folded on the porch railing, as if placed there by unseen hands. A shiver ran down his spine as he turned back to the grieving mother. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. Instead, he simply nodded, leaving the photograph in her hands before stepping back into his car. As he drove away, his mind raced with what had happened. He knew what he had seen, what he had felt. Lillian Harper had been real, at least for those fleeting moments. But she wasn't of this world anymore. James never traveled that road at night again. And though he tried to rationalize the experience deep down, he knew, somewhere in the mist and shadows, Lillian was still waiting for a ride home.